Welcome back to Tanya and 5. The last few days we've been studying chapter 43. In chapter 41 and 42, we describe the entry-level love and fear of God. Namely, the love of God is my desire to be attached and connected to Him, and my fear is the fact that I feel, or at least recognize, that I stand in the presence of God, and therefore I dare not betray His will. Now, these levels are entry level because it begins with the premise that I exist, God exists, and I need to serve Him, or I want to be attached to Him. Now, these feelings come from my understanding of God's investure within creation. When I understand that God is bringing everything into being, and therefore I understand that I'm in His presence, I feel that sense of awe and the sense of duty to serve Him. The greater I understand creation, the greater I understand spiritual worlds, and I understand that God animates them all. The greater my understanding of God's presence, the greater my sense of awe of being in His presence. But the fear is still the same, defined by I'm in God's presence and I cannot betray Him. I cannot transgress His command. The love of God, I want to be attached to God, comes from my understanding that all that exists, considering that God brings it all into being, they are all inconsequential and of nothing compared to Him. And therefore, there is nothing in this world, or even in the loftiest of spiritual worlds, worthy of pursuing, when what I could pursue is an attachment to God, the source of them all. No pleasure can possibly distract me from my desire to attach to God, who is the source of all those pleasures, and before whom all those pleasures are of zero consequence. I talk of both physical pleasures and spiritual pleasures. So, you see, this love and fear is predicated on the foundation that I exist, the world exists, but the entire world and myself are in the presence of God, and therefore I am in awe of Him, and everything that exists is of no consequence compared to Him, and therefore all I want is Him. There is, however, a higher level of love and fear. A fear where it's not that I'm in God's presence and therefore I don't want to betray Him, but rather that there is nothing but Him. If there is nothing but God, myself included, then my very presence is embarrassing. How dare I sit here considering myself independent when the reality is God is the only reality? So this fear doesn't start from the premise I exist and I need to serve Him. This fear begins with the premise of I don't exist, and my existence is embarrassing. My sense of independence is embarrassing. God's the only truth. Now, of course, this kind of fear can only come after a person has studied much Torah and is perfect in his service of God, and that he, in fact, in his behavior, thought, speech, and action, does not betray God's command. Then perhaps he can elevate to the point where his very being itself is embarrassing in God's presence, considering that God's the only reality. And even beyond that, once a person reaches perfection within this higher level of fear, God might grant a gift in which a person may be exposed to the truth of God's being the only reality, and then bask in the pleasure and delight of being in God's reality. Now, obviously, these two levels of love and fear, in which God's the only reality, is something way beyond the beginner, beyond probably most people. And therefore, at the beginning stage, one must begin with the love and fear of I don't want to betray God because I'm in God's presence, and the love that I want to attach to God, and therefore I'm going to do whatever I can to attach to Him. Now, between these two, which one comes first? Do I start off with I want to attach to God, or do I start off with I dare not betray God? Says the Alter Rebbe, it's possible that God will inspire an individual, and out of nowhere, he might start to feel like, God is so beautiful. All I want to do is be one with Him. All I want to do is dedicate my life to serving Him and being attached to Him. And that's fantastic. God might offer us that gift every now and again to get us moving. But if I had to build the slow process of my relationship with God, then it starts with, you're in God's presence, do not betray him. I'm standing here in the presence of God. I dare not do anything he does not want, and I better do everything he asks. The takeaway from all of this is, in our feelings, there's endless types of feelings, including in our relationship with God. This kind of love, love, more intense, less intense, fear, a sense of duty, and those are all great feelings. But those do not constitute a structured relationship with God. If I want to build a proper relationship, it needs to be structured. First of all, I need to have a mashpia, a mentor, a guide. And then it starts off with, I am in the presence of God, and I have a duty to fulfill everything he asks. Looking forward to seeing you when we conclude chapter 43.